The park was quiet under the soft glow of the streetlights, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool night breeze. Most people passed by without a second glance, too preoccupied with their own lives to notice the woman who sat there every evening. She had made the same wooden bench her home for 2 years, her belongings packed into a single battered backpack that she kept close by. Her presence had become a familiar, if mysterious, part of the scenery. She was always polite, offering a faint smile to anyone who made eye contact. Some regular visitors would leave scraps of food or a cup of coffee on the bench before walking away. Despite her seemingly calm demeanor, there was something about her that made people curious and uneasy. She never asked for help, never approached anyone, and yet her eyes carried a weight of unspoken pain that lingered long after you saw her. Rumors swirled around her among the locals. Some whispered she was running from a dangerous past, others said she was grieving a terrible loss. A few even claimed she had chosen the park life intentionally, rejecting society altogether. Whatever the reason, no one dared to ask. Something about her silence seemed sacred, like an unspoken rule that no one wanted to break. For the police officers patrolling the area, she was a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. She wasn't causing trouble, yet her constant presence in the park wasn't something they could ignore. The community had raised concerns, some compassionate and others less so. There were complaints about safety, about how the park was no place for someone like her. But every time officers approached her, she remained calm, cooperative, and unwilling to reveal anything about herself. She had no warrants, no history of disturbances, no apparent reason to be flagged as a problem. Just a quiet woman who had chosen a park bench as her refuge. One officer, a seasoned veteran with a soft spot for the downtrodden, had taken it upon himself to check on her regularly. He had tried everything: small talk, offers of help, even subtle questions to get a sense of her situation. But she always responded with the same gentle, evasive answers. "I'm fine, thank you," or "I don't need anything." Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering. It was as if she had built an invisible wall around herself, impenetrable and unyielding. It wasn't until a particularly cold night in late autumn that things began to change. The officer noticed she looked weaker than usual, her thin jacket no match for the biting wind. Concerned, he decided to press her a little harder. "Listen, we're not here to make trouble for you," he said, crouching down to meet her at eye level. "But this can't go on. It's getting colder, and we need to find you somewhere safe." For the first time in 2 years, she hesitated. Her hands tightened around the straps of her backpack, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something but couldn't bring herself to. The officer waited, his patience unwavering, and then she surprised him. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can't leave." "Not yet." Her words hung in the air like a fragile thread, begging to be pulled. The officer didn't push further that night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she let on. He reported the interaction to his partner, who suggested they dig a little deeper. Maybe there was something in her past, a missing persons report, a family looking for her, that could explain why she was here and why she refused to leave. Over the next few days, the officers discreetly gathered information. They combed through databases, searched for clues, and even asked around the neighborhood. But no records matched her description, no one seemed to know her name, and no one had reported her missing. It was as if she had simply appeared one day, fully formed, carrying the weight of a life no one could trace. Meanwhile, the woman continued her quiet routine, unaware or perhaps unfazed by the quiet investigation surrounding her. She watched the world go by. From her bench, her gaze distant, her thoughts a mystery. The officer who had spoken to her couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. He began stopping by the park more often, bringing her blankets, food, and even a thermos of tea. She accepted these small gestures with a nod of gratitude, but she never let her guard down. Then, one night, everything changed. It was just past midnight when a passerby heard something strange, a faint, haunting melody coming from the park. Following the sound, they found the woman sitting on her bench, humming softly to herself. It was a tune that felt oddly familiar, yet impossible to place. The passerby stood at a distance, captivated by the eerie beauty of the moment. But as they drew closer, the woman abruptly stopped and clutched her backpack tightly, as if protecting something precious inside. The encounter was reported to the police the next morning, and the officers couldn't ignore it. What could possibly be in that backpack that made her so protective? Was it the key to her mysterious past, or something far more troubling? The officers decided it was time to confront her directly. When they approached her that evening, she seemed to sense their purpose. She didn't flinch, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The lead officer spoke gently but firmly. "We need to understand why you're here. It's for your safety and for everyone else's." For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse. Then, with a deep, trembling breath, she unzipped her backpack and revealed its contents. What they saw left them speechless. Inside was a small, battered journal, its pages filled with scribbled notes and drawings. Beneath it, a photograph of a smiling child, a little boy, no older than 5, worn and creased from years of handling. And tucked into the side pocket was a tiny pair of shoes, scuffed and faded but lovingly preserved. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at the officers. "He's here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can feel him. I have to stay until I find him." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Her words didn't make sense, yet the pain in her voice was undeniable. One of them reached for the journal and gently opened it. The pages were filled with desperate notes, coordinates, and cryptic phrases that seemed to hint at something far beyond their understanding. It was clear that the woman believed every word she was saying, even if it sounded impossible. "We'll help you," the lead officer said softly, though he wasn't sure how. "But we need to understand what you're looking for." Her gaze hardened, her determination cutting through her tears. "I'm looking for my son. He was taken from me, and this is where they told me to wait." Her words sent a chill through the officers. Who were they? And why had they left her here, in this park, for 2 long years? As the officers tried to piece together the fragments of her story, a call came through their radios. It was dispatch, reporting something unusual in the area, a disturbance in the park that matched no known patterns. The officers called for backup, unsure of what they were walking into. As they waited, the woman sat silently on her bench, clutching the photograph and the tiny shoes. For the first time, she looked less like a mystery and more like a mother on the edge of despair, clinging to the only hope she had left. What happened next would change everything. The officers stood in tense silence, the stillness of the park broken only by the occasional crackle of their radios. The woman sat hunched on the bench, her fingers trembling as they clutched the photograph of the boy. Her eyes darted to the shadows, scanning the trees as if expecting someone or something to emerge. Backup arrived within minutes, a pair of additional officers stepping out of their vehicle with wary expressions. They exchanged brief nods with the others, their hands resting on their belts as they surveyed the scene. The lead officer approached the woman again, his tone as gentle as he could manage despite the unease creeping into his voice. "Can you tell us more?" he asked. "Who told you to wait here? Why here specifically?" The woman shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. She was struggling, torn between staying silent and the need to be heard. Finally, she exhaled a shaky breath. "They didn't give me a name. Just instructions. They told me this was where he'd be brought back to me. I didn't have a choice." "Who are they?" another officer pressed. "Did you see their faces? Were they strangers?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering with fear. I don't know who they were," she admitted. "I never saw their faces. But they knew about him, about my son. They promised I'd find him if I followed what they said." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Her story sounded fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. But the raw emotion in her voice was undeniable. This wasn't the tale of someone seeking attention, it was the desperate plea of a mother who had been through something unimaginable. What about the journal? The lead officer asked gently. The notes, the coordinates, what do they mean? Her grip on the backpack tightened. It's everything I've been able to figure out, she said softly. I've been tracking patterns. Things they left behind. Messages and places only I would recognize. They're testing me, I think. To see if I'm worthy. Worthy of what? One of the backup officers asked, his skepticism thinly veiled. Of getting him back, she said, her voice breaking. They said if I left this park, I'd never see him again. The officers were silent, absorbing the weight of her words. The situation was unlike anything they'd encountered before. Was she the victim of some cruel manipulation? Or was there more to her story than even she realized? One of the officers motioned to the journal. Do you mind if we take a closer look? He asked carefully. Maybe there's something in here that can help us understand. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, slowly, she nodded. Her hands trembled as she passed the journal to the officer, her eyes darting nervously between him and the book. He flipped it open, scanning the pages with a furrowed brow. The writing was messy, the lines crowded with frantic notes and cryptic symbols. There were dates, coordinates, and phrases that seemed to hint at something hidden just beneath the surface. Some of these locations, the officer murmured, they're all over the state. Did you go to these places? She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Whenever I could. But I never found anything concrete. Just signs. Symbols. Like breadcrumbs leading back here. The officer frowned, flipping to a page marked with a crude drawing of the park. A single word was scrawled across the top, return. Below it were several other phrases, written in a frantic hand, the boy waits. Do not leave. Watch the stars. What does this mean? He asked, pointing to the page. Why the stars? She hesitated, her gaze drifting upward. They told me to watch for a sign, she said. Something in the sky that would tell me it was time. I don't know what it means, but I can't miss it. I can't fail him. The officers exchanged uneasy looks again. This wasn't just a case of a homeless woman with nowhere to go, it was something far more complicated, tangled in grief, hope, and a story that felt both impossible and hauntingly real. As they tried to process her words, the radio crackled again, cutting through the tension. The dispatcher's voice was sharp, urgent. We've got reports of unusual activity in the park. Unidentified lights near the north edge. Be advised. The officers stiffened, their eyes snapping toward the direction of the report. The lead officer turned back to the woman. Stay here, he instructed firmly. We'll check it out. But she shook her head, panic rising in her voice. No. Please, I need to come with you. It could be him, it has to be him. The lead officer hesitated, torn between protocol and the desperation in her plea. Finally, he nodded, motioning for her to follow closely. Together, the small group moved toward the northern edge of the park, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. As they neared the area, they noticed a faint, flickering light in the distance. It wasn't the glow of a street lamp or the beam of a flashlight, it was something else entirely, dim and unsteady, like the pulse of a dying star. The woman's breath quickened, her steps faltering as she clutched the photograph to her chest. Do you see it? She whispered, her voice trembling. We see it, the lead officer replied, his tone cautious. Stay close. The light seemed to grow brighter as they approached, casting long, eerie shadows across the trees. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy that made the hair on their arms stand on end. None of them could explain what they were seeing, and yet none of them could look away. When they finally reached the source, they found themselves standing before a clearing, the light emanating from an object half buried in the dirt. It was small, metallic, and unlike anything they had ever seen. It hummed softly, a low vibration that seemed to resonate in their chests. "What is that?" one of the officers muttered, his voice barely audible. The woman stepped forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "It's them," she whispered. "They left this for me." The lead officer shot her a sharp look. "What are you talking about? What is this thing?" But before she could answer, the humming grew louder, the light intensifying until it was almost blinding. The officers shielded their eyes, their instincts screaming at them to retreat. The woman, however, stood her ground, her gaze locked on the object. "Please," she murmured, tears streaming down her face. "If you're listening, I'm here. I've waited. I've done everything you asked." The light pulsed one final time before fading, leaving the clearing in darkness once more. The object lay silent and still, as if it had never been alive at all. The woman sank to her knees, her sobs breaking the stillness of the night. One of the officers approached cautiously, his flashlight trained on the object. "It's just metal," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "There's nothing here." But the woman shook her head, her fingers digging into the dirt. "No," she insisted. "It means something. It has to." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do next. The situation was spiraling into territory they were completely unprepared for, and yet they couldn't walk away. Something about the woman's conviction, her unwavering belief, kept them rooted in place. The lead officer knelt beside her, his voice soft but firm. "We'll figure this out," he said. "But you need to help us understand. Who are they? What do they want?" She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "I don't know who they are," she admitted. "But I know they're watching. And I know they'll come back." The officer's radio crackled again, a voice cutting through the static. "Dispatch to all units. Be advised, multiple reports of unidentified lights in the area. Possible drones. Proceed with caution." The officers exchanged alarmed glances. Whatever was happening in the park that night, it was far from over. And as the woman sat clutching the photograph of her son, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of hope and fear, one thing was clear: the answers they sought were still just out of reach. The clearing was still, but the air carried a strange charge, as though it held its breath. The object, now lifeless and silent, seemed to mock their efforts to understand. The woman crouched beside it, running her fingers over its cold, metallic surface, whispering words too quiet to hear. The officers stood back, their unease growing with every second. Something about the night felt off, as if they were no longer alone. The radio crackled again, but this time it was nothing but static. The lead officer frowned, tapping it, his voice sharp. "Dispatch, repeat last transmission. We're not receiving you." The static persisted, and the faint hum they had heard earlier returned, not from the object but from the surrounding trees. It was low, barely audible at first, but it seemed to grow, weaving into the fabric of the night like a hidden melody. The officers instinctively reached for their flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness, but all they saw were trees, motionless and silent. The woman suddenly stood, her movements quick and urgent. "They're here," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I can feel it." One of the officers stepped forward, his skepticism slipping into frustration. "Ma'am, you need to step back. We don't know what's going on, but we can't have you putting yourself in danger." She turned to him, her eyes wide and pleading. "You don't understand. This isn't danger, it's the only way. They've come for him." The hum grew louder, a vibration that seemed to seep into their bones. One of the officers scanned the treetops with his flashlight, his voice tight. "What is that sound? Is it coming from above us?" The woman's gaze followed his light, her breath catching. The officers looked up, and for a moment they were certain their eyes were playing tricks on them. Among the branches, Faint points of light flickered, small, shifting orbs that moved like fireflies but emitted an unnatural glow. They darted and hovered, forming patterns that felt deliberate, as though they were spelling out something only the woman could understand. "It's them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're watching." The lead officer stepped closer to her, his voice low. "Ma'am, you need to tell us everything right now. Who are they, and what do they want?" Before she could answer, a sudden, sharp sound pierced the night, a crack like thunder, but it came from the earth beneath their feet. The ground trembled, and the officers staggered, their hands instinctively reaching for support. The woman stood firm, her expression unwavering. "It's happening," she murmured, her voice filled with both fear and hope. The object began to hum again, its surface glowing faintly. It pulsed in rhythm with the lights above, as if communicating with them. One of the officers cursed under his breath, his flashlight shaking as he directed it back at the metallic device. "What is this thing? Is it some kind of tech? A weapon?" The lead officer shook his head, his voice grim. "I don't know, but we need to figure it out fast." The woman stepped closer to the object, her movements deliberate. The officers shouted for her to stop, but she ignored them, her focus solely on the glowing device. Her hands hovered over it, her fingers trembling. "Please," she whispered, as though speaking to someone unseen. "I've done everything you asked. I've waited. I've followed your signs. Just bring him back. Please." The hum intensified, growing louder and deeper, until it was almost unbearable. The lights above began to shift, spiraling into a vortex that seemed to pull the darkness inward. The officers stumbled back, their instincts screaming at them to retreat, but the woman stood her ground, her eyes fixed on the object as tears streamed down her face. "Ma'am, get away from that thing!" The lead officer shouted, his voice edged with panic. "We don't know what it's going to do." But she didn't move. Instead, she dropped to her knees, her hands pressing against the device as though trying to anchor herself to it. The glow grew brighter, flooding the clearing with an otherworldly light. The officers shielded their eyes, their hearts pounding as the intensity of the moment reached its peak. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the light vanished. The hum stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The woman remained on her knees, her hands still resting on the now cold surface of the object. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. The officers stood frozen, their minds racing to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The lead officer was the first to move, stepping cautiously toward the woman. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos in his head. "Are you okay? What happened?" She looked up at him, her face pale but resolute. "It's not over," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "They're testing me." This was only the beginning. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their tension palpable. The night had taken a turn none of them could have anticipated, and they knew instinctively that whatever was happening was far from ordinary. They didn't have answers, only more questions, and a growing sense of dread. The radio crackled again, this time clearer, as the dispatcher's voice cut through the static. "All units, be advised, reports of additional unidentified lights across multiple locations. Backup en route." The lead officer grabbed his radio, his voice sharp. "Dispatch, this is Unit 3. We need immediate intel on these reports. We have an unidentified object and potential civilian risk." Over. The response was delayed, the static filling the air once more before the dispatcher replied. "Unit 3, information is limited. Stay on high alert. Drones are scanning the area." The woman's head snapped up at the word drones, her expression filled with a sudden urgency. "No," she said firmly. "It's not drones. It's them. And they're coming back." The officers tried to reason with her, their voices a mix of concern and frustration, but she wouldn't listen. Her focus was unshakable, her belief unyielding. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew heavier, the silence of the park broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. And then, without warning, the hum returned. This time, it wasn't confined to the object, it seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating through the ground, the air, and their very bones. The lights reappeared, brighter and more numerous, forming a web of glowing threads that stretched across the clearing. The woman rose to her feet, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "It's him," she whispered. "I know it's him." The officers didn't know what to believe, but they could no longer deny that something extraordinary was unfolding before them. They could only watch, their breaths caught in their throats, as the lights began to descend, weaving closer to the earth, pulling the night toward a moment none of them could predict. The lights spiraled closer, their movements deliberate and eerily coordinated. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that pressed down on everyone in the clearing. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their hands hovering near their holsters, though deep down they knew no weapon they carried could contend with whatever this was. The lead officer took a step forward, his voice firm but quivering at the edges. "Ma'am, we need to move you to safety." "Now." The woman didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the descending lights, her face illuminated by their glow. There was something in her expression, a mixture of longing and dread, as if she was on the edge of a truth she had spent years searching for but wasn't sure she was ready to face. She clenched her fists, steadying herself, as the humming intensified and the threads of light began to weave together, forming a shape. The object on the ground pulsed in response, its once dormant surface now flickering like a heartbeat. It was alive again, as if answering a silent call. The woman stepped closer to it, ignoring the officer's warnings, her voice trembling but determined. "I need to stay," she said. "If I leave now, I'll never know. This is what I've been waiting for." Before anyone could argue further, a blinding flash of light erupted from the sky, momentarily swallowing the clearing in an intense, otherworldly glow. The officers shielded their eyes, shouting over the hum that had become almost deafening. When the light dimmed, they saw something impossible, a figure standing amidst the threads of light. It was humanoid but not human. Its body shimmered, its form translucent yet solid, like a being carved from pure energy. The woman gasped, tears spilling down her face. "It's him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You came back." The officers were frozen, torn between the urge to intervene and the instinct to retreat. The lead officer raised his radio again, his hand trembling. "Dispatch, we have visual on an unknown entity. This situation is escalating. We need immediate backup." Before he could finish, the figure turned its head toward them, its movements fluid and unnaturally precise. The hum shifted in tone, almost like a voice trying to break through, though the words were indecipherable. The woman stepped forward, ignoring the officer's shouts, her hands reaching out as if to touch the figure. "It's me," she said softly. "Do you remember?" The figure hesitated, its form flickering like static, and for a moment, it seemed to take a step toward her. But then the ground beneath them trembled violently, and the lights above flared brighter, forming chaotic patterns. The figure's head snapped upward, as if sensing something approaching. Its glow dimmed, and its form shifted, becoming less distinct. "No," the woman cried, her voice filled with desperation. "Don't go! Please don't leave again!" The officers braced themselves as the trembling grew worse. Something massive was descending, a shadow blotting out the stars. It wasn't like the lights or the figure, it was darker, heavier, and carried an overwhelming sense of menace. The hum that had filled the air was replaced by a low, guttural vibration that seemed to claw at their chests. The figure turned back to the woman, its form stabilizing just long enough to reach out a hand. The officers couldn't tell if it was trying to communicate or protect her, but before it could do anything, a beam of dark energy shot down from the shadow above, striking the ground between them. The shockwave sent everyone flying, the force of it knocking the air from their lungs. The woman scrambled to her knees, coughing as she tried to reach the figure again, but it was fading, its form unraveling like threads caught in a storm. The shadow above loomed closer, and for the first time, the woman's resolve wavered. "It's them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They found him." The lead officer pulled himself up, his voice urgent. "Who are they? What's happening?" The woman turned to him, her face pale with fear. "The ones who took him. They don't want him back. And now they know I found him." As if in answer, another beam shot down, this one aimed directly at the object on the ground. The device shattered under the impact, its pieces scattering like shards of glass. The figure let out a sound, not a hum this time, but something closer to a scream. It was fading fast, its form flickering violently, and the woman screamed in frustration, pounding her fists against the ground. The officers regrouped, their instincts screaming at them to retreat, but the lead officer couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene unfolding before him. He didn't know what he was seeing, but he knew it was something far beyond their understanding and something deeply wrong. The woman stood, her fists clenched, her body trembling with a mix of fury and sorrow. "You can't take him again," she said, her voice rising. "I won't let you." The shadow above pulsed, its darkness rippling as more beams of energy began to rain down, targeting the clearing. The officers shouted for her to move, but she stood her ground, her defiance burning brighter than her fear. And then, for the briefest moment, the figure stabilized. It reached out to her, its form shimmering as though it was pouring all its remaining energy into that single gesture. The woman took a step forward, her hand outstretched, and their fingertips almost touched. But the shadow pulsed again, and with a final, shattering wave of light and sound, the figure vanished, its form torn apart by the darkness. The woman collapsed to her knees, her scream of anguish cutting through the chaos. The shadow began to recede, its energy dissipating as quickly as it had appeared. The lights above flickered and dimmed, and the hum that had filled the air faded into silence. The clearing was left in darkness, the only sound the ragged breathing of the officers and the woman's quiet sobs. The lead officer approached her cautiously, his voice soft but firm. "Ma'am, we need to leave. Whatever that was, it's gone now. But we can't stay here." She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the shattered remains of the object, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "It's not over," she said, her voice barely audible. "They'll come back. They always come back." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their minds racing to process what they had just witnessed. None of them had answers, only a growing sense that they had stumbled into something far bigger than themselves, something that couldn't be explained or contained. As they prepared to leave the clearing, the woman turned to the lead officer, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "You don't understand," she said. "This wasn't just about him. It's about all of us. And it's only the beginning." As the officers helped the woman to her feet, the tension in the air hung heavy. They exchanged wary glances, unsure of what had just transpired. The woman's voice, still soft but filled with a quiet resolve, echoed through the silent clearing. "It's not over. Not yet." They couldn't understand what she meant, not fully. But there was no denying the raw emotion in her eyes, the fear, the determination, the grief. The woman wasn't simply running from something. She was fighting for something, and it was a fight that had stretched across years, perhaps even lifetimes. One of the officers moved toward the wreckage of the device, cautiously stepping over the shattered fragments that lay scattered across the ground. He didn't know what he was looking for, but there was a nagging sense that they had only uncovered part of a much larger story. His hand hovered near one of the broken pieces, hesitant to touch it, as if the object could still hold some secret. "That thing," he began, his voice uncertain, "what was it? What's really going on here?" The woman didn't answer at first. Instead, she stood motionless, her gaze still fixed on the remnants of the object, as though her mind was far away. After a long moment, she turned toward the officers. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "That was the key," she said quietly. "The device was meant to act as a beacon. It called to them." The officers exchanged confused glances. The woman's words barely made sense, but the raw emotion in her tone left no room for doubt that this was more than just a wild story. This was something real. Something dangerous, I thought. She swallowed hard, as if the next words were too heavy to say. "I thought it was over. That they would never come back. But I was wrong. They'd been watching. And now they know where I am." The lead officer's brow furrowed. "Who are they?" "What do you mean?" The woman took a shaky breath, turning to face them fully. Her eyes seemed to hold a world of pain and sorrow. "You won't understand. You can't. But I've spent years trying to keep this from happening. From letting them know the truth. But it's too late now." The clearing had fallen silent again, save for the distant hum of the city beyond. The officers, though still shaken by the events they'd witnessed, remained standing in that tense stillness. They had no idea what to believe, what to make of any of this. But one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet, sending a shockwave through the air. The woman's face went pale. Her breath hitched, her eyes wide with terror. "They're coming." The officers scrambled, pulling their weapons instinctively. The woman's voice was frantic now. "No, you don't understand. You need to leave. Now." But it was too late. Above them, the night sky tore open, as if the very fabric of reality had been split apart. A massive ship descended, its shape indescribable, a hulking mass of shifting, shadowy forms that seemed to distort the air around them. The light from the ship flickered, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, and the hum of its engines was deafening, like the sound of 1,000 voices shouting at once. The officers instinctively stepped back, their hands trembling as they aimed their guns at the ship. But the woman didn't move. Her expression was one of acceptance, even resignation. She had been waiting for this moment. She knew it was coming. "I've spent years running," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted this. But now." She looked up at the ship, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of fury and sorrow. "Now, I'll make them understand. I'll make them pay." As the ship hovered above them, a blast of energy shot down, hitting the ground with a force that sent the officers flying backward. The shockwave rattled their bones, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with power. The woman stood firm, unwavering, her eyes locked on the descending vessel. "This is the end," she said, her voice low and steady. "But it's not the end for me. Not yet." The officers, disoriented and struggling to get to their feet, heard the faint sound of a voice coming from the ship. It was alien, distorted, but unmistakably clear. "You cannot hide from us forever." The woman's face hardened, her fists clenching. "I don't intend to," she said, her voice full of determination. Then, in a movement so swift it was almost imperceptible, she raised her hand, and the remnants of the device on the ground began to glow once more. The shattered pieces started to pulse, each fragment connecting, reassembling itself into something new. The officers could only watch in stunned silence as the object transformed, its shape shifting into something that seemed to hum with ancient power. The ship above them seemed to react, its own energy fields flickering in response. The woman's eyes burned with intensity as she whispered something inaudible, and the object on the ground released a pulse of energy that shot straight into the ship's path. The resulting explosion of light and sound was deafening, blinding. The officers shielded their eyes, their bodies pressed to the ground by the force of the blast. When the light faded, they looked up to find the ship no longer a hulking mass of shadow, but something far more alien, far more dangerous suspended in midair. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the ship began to crumble, its form disintegrating, breaking apart piece by piece. The woman stood in the center of the clearing, her hands trembling, but her face filled with a quiet sense of victory. The officers slowly rose, their hearts pounding in their chests. "It's done," she said, her voice soft, but the weight of it filled the air. "For now." But just as they began to breathe again, a soft, eerie laugh echoed through the clearing, high-pitched, cruel. And the woman's eyes widened in realization. "No," she whispered. "It's not over." A new figure emerged from the smoke and debris. It was tall, dark, and unmistakably not human. And in its hands it held something, a small, glowing orb, pulsating with a deadly energy. The woman took a step back, her face filled with dread. The officer's hand shook as he reached for his gun. But before he could fire, the orb began to pulse faster, its glow intensifying. The air shimmered, and time itself seemed to stretch as a new wave of energy surged toward them. And then, everything went black. The world was quiet for a long moment. Silence enveloped the clearing, thick and unnerving, before the sound of breathing filled the air. The officers slowly opened their eyes, and what they saw before them left them speechless. The tall, dark figure had vanished. The orb it had held was gone, and in its place, only the faint traces of energy remained, dissipating into the night. The woman, still standing in the center of the clearing, looked down at her hands, as if trying to process what had just occurred. The confusion in her eyes was evident, but there was also a deep sorrow that seemed to settle over her. The officers hesitated, unsure of what to say or do, but they knew one thing for certain: everything had changed. The woman finally spoke, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. "They're not gone. Not all of them. There's more to this, more than I can stop on my own." One of the officers took a cautious step forward. "Who were they? What's all of this about?" His voice was strained, his mind racing to make sense of the impossible things he had just witnessed. The woman sighed, her gaze distant as she stared into the dark sky. "I've been hiding from them for so long. Running from something I didn't fully understand until now. The device, it was never meant for me. It was meant for them." The other officer frowned. "You said you were trying to stop them? Who are they? And what was that creature?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "They're not creatures. They're not what you think. They've been watching us for centuries, studying us. But they've never seen humans as equals. To them, we're just a stepping stone, a species to be used and discarded." The words hit the officers like a cold wave. They had no idea what she was talking about, but they couldn't ignore the feeling that something far larger was at play. Something that had been going on for much longer than they could have imagined. "But why?" one of the officers asked. "Why come here? Why now?" The woman's expression hardened. "Because I'm not the only one who knows the truth. And the longer I've hidden, the more dangerous it's become. They're not just looking for me anymore. They're looking for everyone who has uncovered their secrets." She paused, as if considering something, and then added, "But they won't stop until they have what they want. And if I don't stop them, it's not just me who will suffer. It's all of us." The officer's face tightened. "So what do we do now?" She turned to face them fully. "We can't do anything. Not yet." Her voice was firm, though she seemed to be carrying an enormous weight. "But there's something I can give you. Something that might help." The woman stepped toward the wreckage of the device, kneeling to retrieve a small, half-broken piece of it. She held it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she examined it. The officers watched, their curiosity piqued, though they still didn't fully understand what they were dealing with. "This," the woman said, her voice low, "is the key. The piece that could stop them. But it's incomplete. I never had the chance to fix it." "What is it?" the officer asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "It's a weapon," she replied simply. A weapon that could reverse everything they've done. The problem is, it needs more power than I can provide. It needs something bigger. The officers exchanged uncertain looks. A weapon that could stop this unseen threat, but it required more than they had at their disposal? The situation was growing more complicated by the minute. Where do we find more power? One of the officers asked, his voice steady but laced with doubt. The woman stood up, her face set in grim determination. I don't know yet. But there's someone. Someone who knows more than I do. They've been hiding, too. They might be able to help. The officer's eyes widened in disbelief. You expect us to just follow you into this unknown? Yes, she said without hesitation. Because I don't have time to explain everything. But I can't do this alone. And you can't ignore what you've seen here tonight. The woman turned, starting to walk away, and the officers had no choice but to follow. They had come here expecting a simple intervention, a routine call to check on a woman sleeping in the park. But they had found so much more than they could have ever imagined. They were no longer just two officers responding to a call. They were players in a much bigger game, one they didn't fully understand, but one they could not walk away from. As they moved through the darkened streets, the woman led them without speaking, her expression focused, her steps purposeful. The officers trailed behind, both of them haunted by the things they had witnessed, unable to shake the overwhelming sense of danger that seemed to hang in the air. They reached a small, inconspicuous building at the edge of the city, tucked away between two larger structures. The woman paused at the door, hesitating for just a moment before knocking. The sound echoed in the quiet night, a small, almost insignificant noise, but to them, it felt like the beginning of something much larger. The door opened slowly, revealing an older man, his face lined with years of experience and knowledge. He looked at the woman, then at the officers, and his eyes softened slightly. You brought them, he said quietly, almost as if he had been expecting them all along. The woman nodded. I need your help. We need to fix this. The man studied the officers for a moment, then gestured for them to come inside. Come in. There's no time to waste. Inside, the space was cluttered with maps, old books, and various pieces of strange equipment. The air was thick with the scent of ink and paper, and the walls were lined with images of distant stars, strange symbols, and what appeared to be blueprints for technology that didn't belong in this world. I'm not sure you fully understand what you're up against, the man said as he led them further into the room. But I've been studying them for years. The creatures you saw tonight, they're not from this world. And they've been manipulating everything, pulling strings behind the scenes. The officers sat down, trying to process everything that was being said. It was a lot to take in. The woman sat across from them, her face grim as she nodded along. We're not just fighting for survival, the woman explained. We're fighting for the truth. For everything they've kept hidden. The man turned toward the officers. If you want to help, you need to understand the bigger picture. You can't just stop them with a weapon. You need to understand how they work, what they want. One of the officers opened his mouth to speak, but the woman stopped him with a look. You don't understand yet. But you will. In time. The room fell silent, the weight of their situation settling over them. They had all come to this point through different paths, but now they shared a common goal. There was no turning back. As the woman, the officers, and the man gathered their thoughts and prepared for the unknown, they realized that this was just the beginning. The threat they faced wasn't going to disappear with a single confrontation. It was much deeper, far more dangerous, and it would require everything they had to stop it. And as they made their plans, the officers couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would they survive? Would they uncover the secrets that had been hidden for so long? For now, all they could do was prepare. Prepare for a fight they couldn't possibly fully understand. But one thing was certain, they were no longer alone. And together, they would stand a chance against whatever came next. The woman's eyes narrowed with determination. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice a promise to herself and everyone else in the room. "Not by a long shot."